Please, human, help! My mother is trapped. The merciless sun beat down on Jake's weathered face as he trudged along the dried riverbed. His boots kicked up plumes of rust-colored dust with each step. 3 years on this god-forsaken planet had taught him to keep moving during the day. Staying in one place meant death from exposure or from the native predators that roam these badlands. Jake paused to check one of his traps. Empty, again, he cursed under his breath. The small burrowing creatures had grown smarter, more wary of his contraptions. He wiped sweat from his brow with a rag stained the same reddish brown as the surrounding terrain. Water levels dropping, food sources depleting, he muttered, recording observations in his worn notebook. Old habits died hard. Though no longer conducting official geological surveys, Jake maintained his field notes meticulously. The distant scream of a sky serpent echoed across the wasteland. Jake instinctively ducked, though the sound was still miles away. Those bastards could spot movement from incredible distances, and he'd seen what remained of the unlucky souls who'd been snatched up in their talons. He continued his patrol of the traps, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat. The crash of the colony ship 3 years ago had left him stranded with dozens of others, but disease, starvation, and the hostile environment had whittled their numbers down. Jake had chosen solitude over the infighting and power struggles of the main settlement. Out here, he answered to no one. As he crested a dune, something caught his eye, a flurry of movement where there should be none. Jake dropped to a crouch, hand moving to the knife at his belt. After the incident with the screaming ones last season, he'd learned to approach anything unfamiliar with extreme caution. A small figure stumbled across the sand, moving erratically. Even from this distance, Jake could see the distinctive blue skin of an Azurian, a child separated from its tribe. Jake remained still, observing. The Azurians were generally peaceful, but contact between humans and the natives had been sporadic and tense since the crash. Some tribes welcomed trade, others had attacked human settlements without provocation. The child staggered, clearly in distress. Jake saw it fall to its knees, then struggle back up, weaving drunkenly across the scorching sand. Dehydration. Damn it, Jake muttered. He should walk away. Getting involved with the natives always led to complications. But watching a child die of thirst wasn't something he could stomach. He stood and waved, shouting, "Hey, over here!" The Azurian child's head snapped up, four-fingered hands shielding its large dark eyes from the sun. It spotted Jake and froze momentarily, before desperation overcame fear. The child lurched toward him with renewed energy, stumbling down the dune. Jake met it halfway, already uncapping his canteen. The Azurian was male, he thought, though with their species it was sometimes hard to tell. No more than the equivalent of an 8-year-old human child, with the characteristic ridged crest running from forehead to the back of the neck. The blue skin was dull and cracked, dangerously dehydrated. "Easy now," Jake said, offering the canteen. "Small sips or you'll make yourself sick." The child snatched the water with trembling hands and gulped desperately despite Jake's warning. Water spilled down his chin and chest, wasting precious drops that were immediately absorbed by the thirsty ground. "Whoa, slow down," Jake said, gently pulling the canteen back. "You'll throw it all up if you drink too fast." The child looked up at him with large liquid eyes, the dark pupils contracting in the harsh sunlight. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and grabbed Jake's leg with surprising strength. "Please, human, help! My mother is trapped!" The child's voice was high-pitched and raspy from dehydration, but the translation implant behind Jake's ear converted the native tongue flawlessly. Jake stiffened. "Trapped? Where? What happened?" "The trembling field," the child gasped, tugging at Jake's pant leg. "She tried to cross, to find me. Please, the night hunters will come." Jake knew about the trembling fields. The company scientists had documented them during the initial survey, colonial organisms that created a surface tension that looked solid but couldn't support weight, essentially organic quicksand, but far more dangerous because of their deceptive appearance. "How long has she been there?" Jake asked, already calculating the odds. "Not good." "Since midday," the child said, desperation in his voice. "I ran for help. Our village is too far. Please." Jake looked toward the horizon. The sun was already beginning its descent. Within 2 hours it would be dusk, and the nocturnal predators would emerge from their burrows. "Show me," he said, securing his pack and checking his knife. "But you need to keep drinking. Small sips." The child nodded eagerly, taking the canteen with more restraint this time. Jake pulled a spare cloth from his pack and draped it over the child's head and shoulders, protection against the brutal sun. "What's your name, kid?" Jake asked as they set off. "Talok," the child replied, matching Jake's long strides with quick, desperate steps. "My mother is Nira. She's a healer." Jake nodded. "I'm Jake. How did you get separated?" Talok's crest flattened in what Jake recognized as shame. "We were gathering salt crystals from the western pools. I saw a thunder lizard nest and went to look. Mother told me to stay close, but—" "You wandered off," Jake finished for him. "Yes," Talok admitted. "When I returned, she was gone. I followed her tracks, but they led to the trembling field. She must have tried to cross it to find me on the other side." They walked in silence for nearly an hour, the terrain gradually changing from sand dunes to a flatter, harder surface. Finally, Talok pointed ahead. "There. The trembling field begins where the ground changes color." Jake saw it now, a vast expanse of slightly darker terrain, almost purplish compared to the surrounding rusty landscape. To the untrained eye, it looked like solid ground, perhaps slightly different in composition, but perfectly walkable. The perfect trap. "Mother!" Talok called out, his voice cracking. Jake squinted against the sun's glare and spotted her, a blue figure in the middle of the field, submerged to her chest in the seemingly solid ground. She wasn't moving, but at Talok's cry, her head turned slightly. Smart woman. She knew that movement would only sink her faster. "Talok?" Her voice was faint but carried across the still air. "I told you to go to the village." "I found help," Talok shouted back, pointing at Jake. Jake assessed the situation grimly. She was at least 50 yards into the field, too far to reach with a rope, even if he had one long enough. The trembling field organisms would simply swallow any rope or pole extended that far. "Nira," Jake called out. "I'm Jake. I'm going to try to help you, but I need you to stay absolutely still." "The sun is setting," she replied, her voice steady despite her dire situation. "They will come when darkness falls." Jake knew exactly what they were, the burrowing predators that hunted by sensing vibrations through the ground. The trembling field was their perfect hunting territory. "I'm aware," he said. "I need to think." He studied the terrain, mind racing through potential solutions. The field organisms created a semi-liquid surface that responded to pressure and weight. Anything heavy would sink, but perhaps something with enough surface area would distribute the weight sufficiently. Jake shrugged off his pack and removed his heavy canvas cloak. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Talok, I need branches. Long, straight ones, as many as you can find." "There are no trees here," Talok said, confused. "The old riverbed," Jake explained. "There might be driftwood. Anything solid and flat. Go quickly." As Talok ran back toward the dried riverbed, Jake continued his preparations. He removed his boots and socks, stripping down to his lightest layer of clothing. Every ounce of weight would count against him. He then laid his cloak flat and began filling it with the contents of his pack, his spare clothes, the empty water canteen, his notebook, and tools. Everything that could create bulk without adding significant weight. He rolled the cloak tightly around these items, creating a long cylinder. Talok returned, arms full of bleached pieces of driftwood and plant matter. Most were too brittle or small to be useful, but a few longer pieces looked promising. Jake selected the sturdiest ones and began lashing them together with strips torn from his spare shirt, creating a crude but functional frame. "What are you making?" Talok asked, watching intently. "A float," Jake replied, working quickly as the sun continued its inexorable descent. "Something to spread my weight across a larger surface area." He attached his improvised roll to the frame, creating a sort of narrow raft. It wasn't much, but it might distribute his weight enough to slow his sinking and allow him to reach Nira. "The night hunters," Nira called from her position. "I can feel their movement beneath. They're awakening." Jake looked at the horizon. The sun was touching it now, painting the sky in violent reds and oranges. He was out of time. Talok, listen carefully, Jake said, gripping the boy's shoulders. If this doesn't work, you run. Understand? You run back to your village. Talok's crest rippled with distress. But no arguments. Someone needs to tell your people what happened. Jake handed him the knife. Take this, just in case. Jake turned to face the trembling field, his makeshift float in hand. He took a deep breath, then stepped onto the edge of the purplish terrain, immediately placing the float in front of him and lying flat upon it. For a heart-stopping moment, he felt the surface give way beneath him. Then the float seemed to stabilize, distributing his weight just enough to keep him from sinking immediately. The surface quivered beneath him, almost as if alive, which of course it was. It's working, Jake muttered, hardly daring to believe it. He used his hands to paddle forward, moving inch by agonizing inch toward Nira. The float sank slightly with each movement, but not catastrophically. The vibrations, Nira warned, they'll attract the hunters. Can't be helped, Jake grunted, continuing his slow progress. Sweat poured down his face despite the cooling evening air. The effort of keeping his body perfectly distributed across the float was taxing every muscle. He was about halfway to Nira when he felt it, a different kind of tremor beneath him, not caused by his movement. Something large was moving under the surface. They're coming, Nira said, her voice remarkably calm. You should go back while you can. Not without you, Jake replied through gritted teeth. He redoubled his efforts, paddling more frantically despite knowing it would accelerate his sinking. 20 feet from Nira, the surface to his right erupted as something broke through. Jake caught a glimpse of glistening scales and rows of needle-like teeth before the creature submerged again, sending ripples across the trembling field. Night Hunter, Talok whispered in terror from the edge of the field. Jake reached Nira at last, his float now sunk to the point where the purplish matter was seeping over the edges. Up close, he could see that she was held fast from the chest down, her arms thankfully still free. Grab the edge of the float, he instructed. Pull yourself onto it, slowly. Nira reached out with blue arms corded with lean muscle. Her fingers grasped the edge of the frame, and she began to pull. The organisms released their grip reluctantly, making wet sucking sounds as she extracted herself inch by inch. Another tremor passed beneath them, stronger this time. The hunter was circling back. It's drawn to our movement, Nira said, still remarkably composed. We won't make it back before it attacks. One problem at a time, Jake replied. Half of Nira's body was now free, resting on the increasingly submerged float. Keep pulling. The sun had disappeared below the horizon now, the light fading rapidly. In the growing darkness, Jake spotted movement along the edges of the field, more shapes emerging from burrows. With a final effort, Nira pulled herself completely onto the float, which sank even further under their combined weight. They were now essentially lying in a shallow depression of the semi-solid matter, which was slowly closing in around them. Now what? Nira asked, her large eyes reflecting the last vestiges of daylight. Before Jake could answer, the surface erupted again, this time directly beside them. The night hunter breached like a sea creature, its elongated body covered in iridescent scales that shimmered in the twilight. Its eyeless head swiveled toward them, guided by sensory pits that detected their every movement. Jake reacted instinctively. As the creature lunged, he thrust his arm into its gaping maw, shoving it deep into the throat. The rows of teeth sliced into his forearm, but before they could close completely, Jake twisted violently, targeting the soft palate he knew existed in most predatory species. The night hunter thrashed in pain, its serpentine body whipping back and forth across the surface of the trembling field. Jake held on grimly, blood streaming down his arm, feeling for the vulnerable spot. His fingers found it, a softer section behind the bony plates of the mouth. He dug in with all his strength. The creature convulsed one final time, then went limp. Jake extracted his mangled arm from its mouth, gasping with pain. You killed it, Nira said, awe in her voice. Not dead, Jake corrected, binding his wounded arm with a strip of cloth. Stunned. Their nervous systems are centralized in the skull. Hit them right and they seize up temporarily. He looked around. More shapes were moving toward them across the field, attracted by the commotion. We need to move. Now. Jake rolled the stunned night hunter onto the increasingly unstable float, providing additional buoyancy and surface area. Then, using the creature's rigid body as a platform, he helped Nira to her feet. "We're going to use it as a stepping stone," he explained. "When I say move, jump as far as you can toward the edge." Nira nodded, gathering her strength. In the near darkness, Jake could see Talok's slight figure at the edge of the field, knife clutched uselessly in his small hands. "Ready?" Hurry. Jake positioned himself. "Move!" They leaped together, clearing the hunter's body and landing several feet closer to safety. The surface gave way beneath them immediately, but before they could sink past their knees, Jake spotted another hunter approaching. "Again!" he shouted. They jumped as the second hunter breached, landing briefly on its back before it twisted away. Jump by jump, hunter by hunter, they made their way toward the edge of the field. Jake's vision blurred from blood loss, his wounded arm hanging uselessly at his side. Nira half-dragged him for the final few jumps until, with one last desperate lunge, they cleared the edge of the trembling field and collapsed onto solid ground. Talok rushed to them, helping his mother to her feet. Behind them, the surface of the field roiled with activity as the night hunters searched for their vanished prey. "You're injured," Nira said, examining Jake's mangled arm in the fading light. "It'll heal," Jake replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced, though. The wounds were deep, and infection was a serious concern on this planet. "Our village is half a day's walk," Nira said, "too far in your condition, but there's a cave system nearby where we can shelter for the night." Jake nodded weakly. "Lead the way." The cave was more of a shallow overhang, but it provided shelter from the wind that had picked up as night fell completely. Talok gathered dried brush for a small fire, while Nira tended to Jake's wounds. "This will hurt," she warned, applying a paste made from crushed plants she'd gathered along the way. The substance burned like fire when it touched his open wounds, and Jake couldn't suppress a groan of pain. "Poison neutralizer," Nira explained. "Night hunter bites contain toxins that prevent blood clotting." "That explains why it won't stop bleeding," Jake said through clenched teeth. "You saved my life," Nira said as she worked, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Why? Your people and mine have had difficulties." Jake considered the question. "Would you have left a human child to die of thirst in the desert?" Nira's crest rippled in what Jake had learned was their equivalent of a smile. "No." "There's your answer," Jake said. "Not all humans are the same, just as I imagine not all Azurians are the same." "True enough," Nira conceded. She finished bandaging his arm with strips of cloth soaked in the medicinal paste. "Rest now, the worst is over." Jake doubted that very much, but exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. He awoke to the sound of movement. Opening his eyes, he saw Talok adding fuel to the small fire. Outside the cave, the sky had lightened to a deep purple. Dawn was approaching. "How long was I out?" Jake asked, his voice raspy from thirst. "All night," Talok replied, offering him a water skin. "Mother went to gather more healing plants. She said your fever broke an hour ago." Jake realized he was drenched in sweat, his clothes clinging uncomfortably to his skin, but the burning pain in his arm had subsided to a dull throb, and his head felt clearer. "You risked your life for us," Talok said, his young face serious in the firelight. "The other humans we've met, they take without asking. They destroy our sacred places looking for minerals." "I'm sorry to hear that," Jake said, and he nodded. The company's aggressive resource extraction had been one of the reasons he distanced himself from the main settlement. "Not all of us agree with those methods." Talok nodded solemnly. "Mother says you have a good spirit. She says you understand the land." "I try to," Jake said. "I was a geologist, someone who studies rocks and soil. I came here to learn, not to take." "Will you teach me?" Talok asked, his crest rising with excitement. "About the stones and the waters?" Before Jake could answer, Nira returned, carrying an armful of plants with blue-tinged leaves. "He needs rest, Talok, not questions," she chided gently. To Jake, she said, "How do you feel?" "Better," Jake replied, surprised to find it was true. "Whatever you used on these wounds, it works." "Sunfern extract," Nira explained, crushing more leaves into a fresh paste. "It accelerates healing and fights infection. Our bodies produce it naturally, but humans lack the enzymes. As she reapplied the bandages, Jake studied her face. In the growing light, he could see the fine network of darker blue markings across her cheeks and forehead. Status symbols among the Azurians, denoting her role as a healer. Your village, Jake said. How far is it from the human settlement? Nira's hands paused momentarily. 3 days' journey east, near the foothills. We moved there after the sky fire brought your people. Our previous home was too close to where your kind settled. Jake nodded. The crash site. The company had quickly established a base camp there, which had grown into a rudimentary colony as they waited for rescue, a rescue that Jake increasingly doubted would ever come. The humans at the settlement, Jake said carefully. They don't know much about this land, about the dangers. They're scared, and scared people make bad decisions. Like crossing trembling fields? Nira asked with a slight tilt of her head. Jake laughed despite himself, wincing as the movement jarred his injured arm. Exactly like that. A sudden rumbling sound interrupted their conversation. Jake stiffened, immediately alert. What's that? Nira's crest flattened against her skull, a sign of alarm. Patrol vehicles! Your people's machines! The rumbling grew louder. Talok rushed to the mouth of the cave, peering out cautiously. Many machines, he reported, voice tight with fear, coming this way. Jake struggled to his feet, ignoring the wave of dizziness that swept over him. He joined Talok at the cave entrance and saw a column of dust on the horizon, the unmistakable signature of the company's all-terrain vehicles. They never patrol this far from the settlement, Jake muttered. Unless they're looking for something specific, Nira finished for him. Jake nodded grimly. Or someone. He scanned the approaching vehicles through narrowed eyes. 5 heavy transports, each capable of carrying a dozen armed personnel. This was no routine patrol. This was a search party. They're looking for me, Nira realized, because of what happened at the western outpost last moon cycle. Jake turned to her, questioning. She met his gaze steadily. Your people established a mining operation near our sacred healing pools, she explained. We asked them to stop. They refused. There was conflict. How many casualties? Jake asked, already calculating the odds against them. None of your people died, Nira said firmly. We do not take life, but several were injured and your machines were disabled. Jake nodded. That explained the show of force. The company didn't tolerate resistance, especially not from the natives they considered primitive. We need to move, he decided. They'll have trackers with them. You're not fully healed, Nira protested. The Sunfern needs more time to work. We don't have more time, Jake said, already gathering his meager possessions. Those vehicles will be on us in 20 minutes. We need to reach the foothills before they cut us off. Nira hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply. Talok, gather our things, quickly. They broke camp with practiced efficiency, leaving no trace of their presence. As they prepared to depart, Jake studied the terrain that lay between them and the distant foothills. Mostly open ground, they'd be spotted easily if the vehicles came this way. There's another route, Nira said, reading his thoughts. Through the stone maze. The vehicles cannot follow there. The stone maze is dangerous, Talok objected. The ground shakers nest there. Ground shakers? Jake questioned. Large predators, Nira explained. They sense movement through rock vibrations, but they're less dangerous than your people's weapons. Jake made a quick decision. The stone maze it is. They set off at a brisk pace, keeping low to the ground and using what little cover the terrain offered. Behind them, the company vehicles had changed direction, now moving directly toward their position. Someone had spotted their tracks. They're faster than I expected, Jake muttered, pressing a hand to his wounded arm. Despite Nira's treatment, it throbbed painfully with each heartbeat. The trackers, Nira said grimly. They have someone who knows our ways. Jake's jaw tightened. There was only one person that could be, Marcos, a former xenobiologist who had spent years studying the Azurians before the crash. A man who had once been Jake's friend before the resource wars changed him. They reached the entrance to the stone maze just as the lead vehicle crested a nearby rise. Jake heard the distinctive whine of its engine, shifting to a higher gear as the driver spotted them. Inside, he urged, pushing Talok ahead of him. Move! The stone maze lived up to its name, a labyrinth of towering rock formations. eroded by wind and water into impossible shapes. Narrow passages wound between them, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through in places. No vehicle could navigate this terrain. "This way," Nira directed, taking the lead. "Stay on the marked path." Jake saw them then, subtle symbols carved into the rock at key junctions, invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. The Azurians had used this route for generations. Behind them, the vehicles had stopped at the entrance to the maze. Jake heard shouted commands, then the sound of equipment being unloaded. They were continuing on foot. "They're following," he warned. "How far to the other side?" "Too far," Nira admitted. "They'll catch us before we exit." Jake's mind raced, considering options. These ground shakers, how do they hunt? Nira's crest rippled with understanding. They sense vibrations through the stone. The louder the disturbance, the more they're attracted. "Perfect," Jake said, a plan forming. "We need to split up." "No," Telok protested immediately. "Listen," Jake insisted, crouching to the boy's level. "I'll create a distraction. Make enough noise to draw both the company men and the ground shakers. You and your mother can slip through to the other side while they're occupied." "You'll be killed," Nira said flatly. "Maybe not," Jake replied with more confidence than he felt. "I know these men. I know how they think, and I've survived worse than ground shakers." The sound of pursuit grew louder. The company men were gaining ground. "There's no time to argue," Jake said. "Which way leads deeper into the maze?" Nira hesitated, then pointed to a narrow passage on their left. "That path circles back eventually, but it passes near the main nesting grounds." "Perfect," Jake said again. He turned to Talak and placed his good hand on the boy's shoulder. "Take care of your mother. I'll find you when I can." Before either could object further, Jake darted down the indicated passage. Behind him, he heard Nira whisper something to Talak, then the soft sound of their retreat in the opposite direction. Jake moved as quickly as he dared through the winding passages, his injured arm clutched tight against his chest. When he judged he'd put enough distance between himself and the Azurians, he began his distraction. He picked up a loose stone and slammed it repeatedly against the rock wall, creating a thunderous echo through the maze. "Hey!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. "Over here!" His voice bounced off the stone walls, amplified and distorted. He continued making as much noise as possible, moving deeper into the maze as he did so. It didn't take long for his plan to work. Too well. He heard the company men change direction, their boots scraping on stone as they hurried toward the source of the commotion. But he also felt a new vibration through his feet, a rhythmic trembling that grew stronger with each passing second. The ground shakers were coming. Jake increased his pace, still making noise, but now looking desperately for a defensible position. He rounded a corner and found himself in a small clearing surrounded by tall stone spires. Multiple passages led out in different directions, but there was no time to choose one. The first of the company men appeared at the entrance to the clearing, weapon raised. Jake recognized him, Wilson, one of Harkin's security team. The man's eyes widened in recognition. "Reeves, what the hell are you doing out here?" Before Jake could answer, the ground beneath their feet gave a violent lurch. Cracks appeared in the stone floor of the clearing, spreading outward from the center like a spider's web. "Run!" Jake shouted, already diving for the nearest passage. "Ground shakers!" Wilson hesitated a fatal moment too long. The stone beneath him erupted as a massive creature burst through, its armored body segmented like an enormous centipede. Rows of stone-crushing mandibles clicked and snapped as it seized the screaming man in its front appendages. Jake didn't wait to see more. He scrambled down the passage, hearing more ground shakers emerging behind him. The men's screams and gunfire created even more vibrations, drawing more creatures. He ran blindly now, taking turns at random, his only goal to put as much distance as possible between himself and the chaos behind him. His wounded arm slammed against a stone outcropping, sending fresh waves of pain shooting up to his shoulder, but he didn't slow down. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sounds of battle faded. Jake slowed to a walk, then finally stopped, leaning against a rock wall as he struggled to catch his breath. His injured arm was bleeding again, the makeshift bandage soaked through. "Not my best plan," he muttered to himself, tearing a fresh strip from his shirt to rebind the wound. The ground suddenly trembled beneath his feet, gentler than before, but unmistakable. Something was coming. Jake looked around frantically for an escape route, but the passage ahead was blocked by a recent rockfall, and going back meant facing whatever was approaching. The trembling grew stronger. Jake pressed himself against the wall, knife drawn with his good hand, though he knew it would be useless against a ground shaker. He could only hope it was smaller than the ones he'd seen in the clearing. A section of the wall beside him suddenly shifted, swinging inward like a door. Jake nearly fell through the opening, catching himself at the last moment. Nira stood on the other side, her finger pressed to her lips in the universal sign for silence. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He slipped through the hidden door, which Nira quickly sealed behind him. They were in a narrow tunnel that looked artificially constructed, its walls smooth and lined with some kind of bioluminescent fungus that cast everything in a pale blue light. "Secret passage," Nira whispered. "Our ancestors built them throughout the stone maze." "Smart ancestors," Jake replied with feeling. "Where's Talok?" "Safe at the other end," Nira assured him. "Come, we must hurry." They moved swiftly through the hidden tunnel, which bypassed the worst of the stone maze. Jake's respect for Azurian ingenuity grew with each step. These people weren't the primitives the company believed them to be. They were sophisticated survivors with deep knowledge of their world. They emerged from the tunnel into a narrow ravine that cut through the foothills. Talok waited there, his crest rising with relief when he saw Jake. "You're alive," the boy exclaimed. "I told Mother you would be." "Thanks to your mother," Jake said, nodding gratefully to Nira. "Those passages are incredible." "They've saved our people many times," Nira replied. "Now they've saved you too." Jake looked back toward the stone maze, where distant sounds of conflict could still be heard. The company men won't stop coming, not now that they know we're out here. "Then we must reach the village quickly," Nira decided. "Our defenses are stronger there." They set off again, following the ravine as it wound deeper into the foothills. Jake's strength was fading, the combination of blood loss and exertion taking its toll, but he forced himself to keep pace. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded completely, replaced by an ominous silence. "They'll bring the heavy weapons next," Jake warned as they paused to rest. "Harkins won't tolerate being outmaneuvered like this." "Harkins?" Nira questioned. "Head of security at the settlement," Jake explained. "A dangerous man who solves problems with force." "Like most of your kind," Nira observed. Jake couldn't argue with that assessment. "Which is why we need to prepare your people." "How far to the village now?" "We'll reach it by nightfall," Nira said, "if we keep moving." They continued their journey as the sun climbed toward its zenith, bringing punishing heat even to the ravine. Jake's condition deteriorated steadily, his wounded arm swollen and hot to the touch despite Nira's treatments. Fever set in by mid-afternoon, making each step an exercise in willpower. "We should rest," Nira suggested, noticing his labored breathing. "Just for a short while." Jake shook his head stubbornly. "No time. Harkins will have called for aerial support by now. We need to reach the village before they find us in the open." As if summoned by his words, a distant mechanical whine reached their ears, the unmistakable sound of the company's scout drones. All three froze, instinctively pressing themselves against the ravine wall. "They're searching the area," Jake whispered. "The drones can't penetrate deep ravines very well, but if we're spotted..." He didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew what would follow: the heavy transports, armed security teams, maybe even the few military-grade weapons the company had salvaged from the crash. They waited in tense silence as the drone passed overhead, its sensors sweeping the terrain below. After several heart-stopping moments, the sound faded as the machine continued its search pattern elsewhere. "We need to move faster," Jake said, pushing himself away from the wall with effort. "They'll be back with a more thorough search pattern." They quickened their pace, Nira now supporting Jake when he stumbled. The ravine began to widen as they progressed, gradually opening into a broader valley. Ahead, Jake could see patches of blue-tinged vegetation, the first signs of cultivation. "The outer fields," Telok confirmed, his voice rising with excitement. "We're almost home." The valley broadened further, revealing terrace gardens cut into the hillsides. The blue plants grew in carefully maintained rows, a stark contrast to the wild terrain they had traversed. In the distance, structures became visible. the domed dwellings of an Azurian village. They had almost reached the first terrace when the drone returned, its sensors immediately locking onto their movement in the open ground. A shrill alarm pierced the air as the machines circled overhead, pinpointing their position for the forces that would surely follow. "Run," Jake urged, releasing Nira's supporting arm. "Get to the village! Warn them!" "Not without you," Nira insisted, gripping his arm more firmly. "Together." They sprinted the remaining distance to the village, the drone tracking their every move. By the time they reached the first dwellings, a crowd of Azurians had gathered, alarmed by the mechanical intruder hovering above their home. An elder stepped forward, his crest elaborate and his bearing dignified despite the obvious tension. "Nira, what is the meaning of this?" "Humans," she replied tersely, "coming in force. This one helped us escape, but others follow." The elder's gaze fell on Jake, assessing him quickly. "A friend?" "Yes," Nira said without hesitation. "He saved my life, twice now." The elder nodded once, decision made. "Take him to the healing chamber. The rest of you prepare our defenses. They must not find us unprepared this time." The village erupted into organized activity. Jake watched, impressed, as the Azurians moved with practiced efficiency, gathering weapons, primitive by human standards, but effective in the right circumstances, and securing vulnerable points around the perimeter. Nira led Jake to a domed structure near the center of the village. Inside, the air was cooler and filled with the sharp medicinal scent of the sunfern and other healing plants. She helped him onto a pallet of woven fibers, then began unwrapping his infected arm. "Your people are well organized," Jake observed as she worked. "This isn't the first time they've prepared for an attack." "The third since the Sky Fire," Nira confirmed grimly. "The first time we were driven from our ancestral home. The second we lost our western healing grounds. This time," she didn't complete the thought, but Jake understood. This time they had nowhere else to retreat to. This was their final stand. "The company doesn't understand what they're destroying," Jake said. "They see resources, not a civilization." "And you?" Nira asked, applying fresh sunfern paste to his wound. "What do you see?" "People," Jake replied simply. "Different from humans, but people nonetheless, with knowledge and wisdom my kind could learn from, if they'd just listen." Nira's crest rippled with what Jake now recognized as a mixture of surprise and appreciation. Strange words from a human. "I was a geologist, not a soldier," Jake reminded her. "I came here to study this world, not conquer it." She finished rebinding his arm and offered him a bowl of clear liquid. "Drink, it will help with the fever." Jake drank deeply, grimacing at the bitter taste. Almost immediately, a cooling sensation spread through his body, temporarily subduing the fire in his veins. "Thank you," he said, handing back the empty bowl. "Now we need to talk strategy. How many warriors can your village field?" "Warriors?" Nira seemed confused. "We are not a warrior people, Jake. We defend, we do not attack." "Defenders then," Jake amended. "How many?" "Perhaps 40 capable of fighting," she estimated. "But our weapons are no match for your people's technology." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Numbers won't matter if Harkins brings the heavy artillery. We need to use your knowledge of the terrain, create advantages where we can." A commotion outside interrupted their planning. Jake struggled to his feet, Nira supporting him as they moved to the entrance of the healing chamber. Outside, the village was in an uproar, Azurians pointing toward the valley entrance where a single human figure was approaching on foot, arms raised in the universal gesture of surrender. "Marcos," Jake hissed, recognizing the former xenobiologist even at this distance. "The tracker." "You know this human?" Nira asked. "We worked together before." Jake's expression hardened. "He's dangerous, not because he's violent, but because he understands your people, knows your weaknesses." "Why does he come alone?" the elder asked, approaching them. "To talk," Jake replied grimly, "to negotiate surrender terms. It's Harkins' standard approach. Offer the carrot before using the stick." The elder considered this. "Should we hear him?" Jake weighed the options quickly. "Yes, it buys us time to prepare, but don't trust anything he offers." The elder nodded and signaled to the perimeter guards. They parted, allowing Marcos to enter the village, though they kept their weapons trained on him. The man walked confidently into their midst, his eyes quickly finding Jake among the blue-skinned crowd. Jake Reeves, Marcos greeted him, his tone conversational despite the tense circumstances. Hardly recognized you with that beard. Going native, I see. Marcos, Jake acknowledged coldly. Still doing Harkin's dirty work? Marcos shrugged, unperturbed by the hostility. Someone has to build bridges between our species. Though your approach seems unorthodox. He turned to address the elder directly. I come with an offer from the Settlement Council. A peaceful resolution to our current situation. Which is, the elder prompted, his dignity unmarred by the human's condescending tone. Simple, Marcus replied. You surrender the fugitives, yes, including our friend Jake here, and relocate your people to the designated reservation area we've established. In return, you have our word that no harm will come to your people. The elder's crest remained perfectly still, a sign of deep control. And if we refuse? Marcos sighed theatrically. Then I'm afraid matters will be taken out of my hands. Director Harkins has deployed significant forces that are currently surrounding your village. The outcome of resistance would be regrettable. He's bluffing, Jake interjected. The company doesn't have enough manpower to surround this entire valley. They're concentrated at the main entrance. Marcos smiled thinly. Always the clever one, Jake. But things have changed since you went rogue. The settlement has grown. Our capabilities have expanded. Do you really want to gamble with these people's lives on outdated information? The elder raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that had broken out among his people. We will consider your offer, he said formally. Return at sunset for our answer. Marcos looked as though he might object, then thought better of it. Very well, sunset, but be aware. Director Harkins is not a patient man. With that, he turned and walked back the way he had come, his posture relaxed despite the hostile stares that followed him. He's lying about their forces, Jake said once Marcos was out of earshot. But he's not lying about Harkin's intentions. If we refuse, they'll attack. Then we prepare, the elder decided, for all possibilities. As the Azurians resumed their defensive preparations with renewed urgency, Jake pulled Nira aside. There's something else, he said quietly. Something we can use. The company's dependence on technology is their weakness. Their vehicles, their weapons, all require power cells salvaged from the crash. Without them, they're just scared humans with clubs. Nira's crest rippled with interest. How does this help us? The stone maze, Jake explained. The ground shakers generate powerful electromagnetic fields when they swarm. I've seen what they do to electronic equipment. If we could lure Harkin's forces into the right position, understanding dawned in Nira's eyes. A trap. Exactly, Jake confirmed. Not to kill them, but to strip away their advantage. Level the playing field. The risk would be great, Nira cautioned. The ground shakers do not distinguish between human and Azurian. True, Jake acknowledged, but I don't see another option that doesn't end in bloodshed. Nira considered this, then nodded slowly. I will speak with the elder, but we'll need bait for this trap. Jake met her gaze steadily. I know. The sun was low on the horizon when Jake stood at the village perimeter, watching Marcos approach once more. Behind him, the Azurians had completed their preparations as best they could. The women, children, and elderly were hidden in the cave network beneath the village, while the defenders stood ready, their primitive weapons clutched with determined hands. The elder stepped forward to meet Marcos, Jake, and Nira flanking him on either side. The xenobiologist's expression was coolly confident as he stopped before them. Your decision, he prompted without preamble. The elder drew himself up to his full height. We decline your offer. This is our home. We will not abandon it. Marcos sighed, a gesture of practiced regret. I was afraid you'd say that. A pity. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Jake. You could still save yourself, you know. Harkins might be persuaded to show leniency, given your expertise. Pass, Jake replied tersely. I've seen Harkins's version of leniency. Marcos shrugged. Your funeral. He tapped his communicator. They've refused. Proceed as planned. Almost immediately, the sound of engines filled the valley as the company's vehicles roared to life. Lights appeared at the valley entrance, at least a dozen heavy transports, their headlamps cutting through the gathering dusk. That's our cue, Jake murmured to Nira. Ready? She nodded, her expression resolute. To the elder, she said, we'll draw them away from the village. Be prepared if we fail. The elder placed a four-fingered hand on each of their shoulders, a blessing and a farewell. May the land protect its own. Jake and Nira slipped away from the village perimeter, using the terraced gardens as cover as they made their way toward a side passage that led back toward the stone maze. Behind them, they could hear Marcos issuing commands to the advancing forces. Remember, Jake whispered as they reached the passage entrance, we need to make enough noise to draw both the company forces and the ground shakers, but not so much that we're caught in the middle. A delicate balance, Nira observed dryly. Let us hope your plan works better than your last one. Despite the dire circumstances, Jake found himself smiling. Fair point. They moved swiftly through the passage, which narrowed as it approached the stone maze. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Marcos must have spotted their departure and redirected some of the forces to follow them. Here, Nira said, stopping at a junction where their passage intersected with another. This leads directly to the main nesting grounds. The other path circles around to rejoin the village from the south. Jake nodded. Perfect. You take the southern route. I'll handle the distraction. Nira seized his arm. That wasn't the plan. We do this together. The plan changed when I saw how many forces Harkins brought, Jake replied firmly. Someone needs to warn the village to prepare for those who don't follow us. That's you. Nira's crest flattened with frustration. You can barely stand. Your arm will hold up long enough, Jake interrupted. This is the only way, Nira. You know it as well as I do. For a moment, he thought she would continue arguing. Then her expression softened, and she reached up to touch his face with cool blue fingers. You are a strange human, Jake Reeves, she said, echoing her words from earlier, but a brave one. Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, an intimate Azurian gesture he recognized from his xenobiology studies. Then she was gone, darting down the southern passage with the natural grace of her species. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. His arm throbbed painfully, and the fever still burned through his system, but determination pushed these concerns aside. He'd survived 3 years on this brutal planet. He could survive one more night. He moved deeper into the stone maze, deliberately making noise now, scraping his boots on the stone floor, occasionally calling out as if to a companion. Behind him, he heard the company forces approaching, their equipment clanking and voices carrying in the confined space. The passage opened into a large chamber, the same one where he'd encountered the ground shakers earlier. The floor was still broken where the creatures had emerged, but there was no sign of them now. Perfect. Jake positioned himself in the center of the chamber and waited. It didn't take long. The first of the company's security team appeared at the chamber entrance, weapons raised. More followed, spreading out to surround him. Finally, Harkins himself stepped into the chamber, his face twisted with triumph. Jake Reeves, he said, voice echoing off the stone walls. The prodigal son returns. Harkins, Jake acknowledged, keeping his stance relaxed despite the weapons trained on him. Still solving problems with a sledgehammer, I see. Harkins smiled coldly. It gets results, unlike your diplomatic approach. He gestured to the security team. Secure him. We'll deal with the blueskins after we get what we need from this traitor. 2 men approached cautiously, stun batons ready. Jake didn't resist as they grabbed his arms, though he couldn't suppress a wince as one seized his injured limb. Careful with the merchandise, Harkins instructed. I want him conscious for questioning. Jake felt the ground beneath his feet begin to tremble, subtly at first, then with increasing intensity. The security team felt it too, exchanging nervous glances. Sir, one of them said to Harkins, we should move out. This area isn't stable. Harkins waved dismissively. It's just aftershocks from the mining operations. Nothing to worry about. It's not aftershocks, Jake said, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. It's ground shakers, and you just walked your entire team into their feeding ground. As if on cue, the floor erupted as massive segmented creatures burst through the stone. Chaos erupted instantly, men screaming, weapons firing, the creatures' mandibles clicking as they seized anything that moved. The men holding Jake released him, reaching for their weapons. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. He bolted for a narrow side passage, one the ground shakers would be too large to follow through. Behind him, he heard Harkin's bellowing orders that went unheeded in the panic. He sprinted through the passage, ignoring the pain shooting up his arm with each stride. The sounds of battle faded behind him, replaced by a more alarming noise. The distinctive electronic whine of equipment failing as the ground shaker's electromagnetic field disrupted power cells and circuits. The passage began to slope upward, eventually emerging onto a ledge overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, Jake could see the entire battleground. The village glowing with bioluminescent light at the far end, the company forces now in disarray as their vehicles and equipment failed simultaneously. Some of the security team had escaped the stone maze and were retreating toward the valley entrance, abandoning their disabled vehicles. Others were still trapped inside, the flashes of their increasingly erratic weapons fire visible through cracks in the stone structures. "It worked," Jake murmured, allowing himself a moment of relief. The company forces were scattered, their technological advantage neutralized. The Azurian village would be safe for now. He turned to make his way back to the village and found Nira standing there watching him with an unreadable expression. "I thought I told you to warn the village," Jake said, but there was no real reproach in his tone. "I did," she replied simply. "Then I came to find you. It seems you survived your own plan this time." Jake chuckled wearily. "Barely. Harkins might not be so lucky." "The ground shakers rarely kill," Nira informed him. "They feed on mineral deposits in the rock, not flesh. Your friend will likely survive with nothing worse than wounded pride." "He's not my friend," Jake corrected, "and wounded pride makes him more dangerous, not less. This isn't over." "No," Nira agreed, moving to stand beside him at the ledge. "But it is a beginning." She gestured toward the village, where Azurians were cautiously emerging to assess the situation. "My people see now that resistance is possible, that cooperation with humans like you offers more hope than surrender to humans like him." Jake nodded slowly, understanding the significance of what they had accomplished. Not a final victory, but a shift in the balance of power, a demonstration that knowledge could overcome force. "What happens now?" he asked, suddenly aware of how weak he felt, the adrenaline fading from his system. Nira took his arm, supporting him as they began the descent toward the village. "Now," she said firmly, "you rest and heal properly. Then we plan for what comes next." "Next?" Jake questioned. "The company will return," Nira said matter-of-factly. "Perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. With new tactics, new weapons. We must be ready." Jake considered this, then nodded. "You're right, and next time we'll be better prepared." As they approached the village, Azurians gathered to meet them, their crests raised in what Jake now recognized as their expression of triumph and joy. Talok broke from the crowd, running to embrace his mother, then surprising Jake by doing the same to him. "You did it," the boy exclaimed. "The elder says you saved us all." Jake looked over Talok's head to where the elder stood waiting, his ancient eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and solemn understanding. They both knew this victory was temporary, a single battle in what would likely be a long war for survival. But for tonight, at least, the Azurians were safe, and Jake, for the first time since the crash, had found a purpose beyond mere survival. He had found a people worth fighting for, a cause worth sacrificing for. As Nira led him to the healing chamber where he could finally rest, Jake looked back at the distant stone maze where the company forces were still in disarray. Harkins would return, undoubtedly with a vengeance. But when he did, he would find not just Jake waiting for him, but an alliance forged in adversity, humans and Azurians standing together against those who would destroy this world rather than learn from it. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a beginning.